In the heart of a city where corruption festered like a disease, Samuel Clarke had spent his life documenting its every mutation. Samuel, a retired forensic accountant, had once been the quiet force that unraveled financial crimes lurking beneath the surface of the law enforcement system. For decades, he tracked every missing dollar, every fabricated financial statement, and every illegal transfer. His files, tucked away in his small study, were not just records. They were a weapon. The city, which had long ago embraced corruption as a standard practice, was no stranger to these illicit operations. Samuel had been investigating the ties between the police department and the state's political elite, exposing a massive money laundering operation that funneled stolen funds through a shadowy network of shell companies. At the center of it all was a trust, the Blackwell Trust, which on the surface appeared as a legal financial entity, but in reality acted as the conduit for the dirty dealings of high-ranking officials. Samuel's meticulous records were the last barrier standing between the people in power and the complete concealment of their crimes. But Samuel wasn't just an accountant. He was a man who could never let go of a case. Even in retirement, his habits of tracking suspicious financial flows and identifying discrepancies never left him. Samuel's greatest asset, however, was his son, Michael Clarke, a federal judge with an unrivaled reputation for dismantling corrupt empires piece by piece. Michael had followed his father's footsteps into the justice system, using his legal expertise to bring down empires built on stolen wealth. He had, over the years, gained a reputation as someone who didn't just follow the law but redefined it, making him both a symbol of hope and a target for those in power. While Michael had made waves in his career, Samuel's past work had remained under the radar, until now. The two men, though connected by blood, were unknowingly about to face a battle that would pull them into the heart of a conspiracy that reached farther than they could imagine. One fateful evening, as Samuel walked through his quiet suburban neighborhood, he crossed paths with his neighbors, Mrs. Hargrave watering her garden, and a few kids playing on the sidewalk. But he had no idea that this familiar walk to the corner store would be the last quiet moment of his life. Samuel's evening routine, which consisted of picking up a newspaper, greeting the storekeeper, and sometimes buying a pint of ice cream, was about to take an unexpected turn. The young officer, Jake Harris, was just 3 months out of the academy. Harris sat in the patrol car, looking at the elderly man across the street, who was walking at a deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings, as he always did. For Harris, it was an unremarkable scene. Yet the senior officer, Frank Dawson, had warned him that this man, Samuel Clarke, was a potential troublemaker. Samuel, though unassuming in his khakis and button-down shirt, had been on their radar for years, not because of anything he had done, but because of his relentless pursuit of justice and his ability to expose deep corruption. "Dawson said he's a problem," Harris muttered, glancing at the file on his lap. Dawson, who had more years on the force than Harris had been alive, just nodded. "We'll see. Keep an eye on him, just in case." Across the street, Samuel entered the small store, as he had done countless times. The storekeeper, Tom, was a friendly face he'd known for years. But today, something felt off. The new clerk, a nervous young man named Evan, was watching a pair of teenagers too closely as they browsed the snack aisle. Samuel noticed the tension in the air, but he couldn't pinpoint why. "Can I help you find something?" Evan asked the teenagers, his voice tinged with suspicion. The boys, no older than 16 or 17, looked uncomfortable as they responded. "Just looking." Samuel raised an eyebrow as he observed the interaction. He had been a part of this neighborhood for years and had never seen a clerk behave this way. The suspicion seemed to be aimed solely at the young men, who were doing nothing more than browsing the aisles. One of the boys reached for a couple of energy drinks and a bag of chips, but when he tried to pay, Evan demanded ID, despite the fact that Samuel knew this was not the store's policy. Samuel couldn't remain silent. He stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "This is the first time I've seen you ask for ID in 15 years, Evan," Samuel said, his voice steady. "This isn't store policy, and it's discriminatory. You're harassing these kids for no reason." Evan's face flushed red. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, a bit too aggressively. Samuel didn't back down. "It does concern me. You can't selectively enforce rules just because someone looks different from you." Evan shot him a defiant look. "I'll call the cops." "They're already here," Samuel replied, gesturing subtly to the police car parked across the street. "They've been watching the store for almost an hour." The young men exchanged worried glances, but Samuel kept his focus on Evan. "I'll take my newspaper, and these boys will take their purchases. Then we can talk to Tom about his new hiring policies." Samuel turned to the teenagers. "Pay for your items. I'll wait with you outside." The officers watching the situation unfold from their patrol car didn't wait for more. Harris, eager to act, looked to Dawson. "You ready?" Harris asked. Dawson nodded, already opening the door. "Let's go. This is the kind of thing we need to keep under control." Samuel Clarke had seen a lot in his life: corruption, deceit, and manipulation. As a forensic accountant, he had spent years uncovering financial schemes that made ordinary citizens suffer for the greed of a few. But nothing could prepare him for what was about to unfold that evening. He had no idea that the simple act of stepping into Wilson's corner store would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. As Samuel paid for his newspaper and watched the two teenagers leave the store, the clerk, Evan, stepped forward to intercept them. His eyes darted nervously toward the door as if expecting something to happen. Samuel's instincts, honed by years of investigating complex financial crimes, sensed something was off. He watched as Evan demanded IDs from the teens, something that had never happened in all the years Samuel had come to Wilson's. The behavior felt aggressive and out of place. He saw the teens hesitate, and he felt a pang of injustice. The two were just kids trying to buy snacks. There was no reason for them to be treated like criminals. Before he knew it, Samuel had intervened, stepping into the fray with calm authority. "You can't treat people like this, Evan," Samuel said, his voice even but firm. "This isn't the store policy. These kids just want to buy their chips, and you're harassing them." Evan bristled at the comment. His face turned red, and he retorted, "This doesn't concern you, old man. Keep your nose out of it." But Samuel wasn't the type to back down. He had fought systems like this his whole life. "It does concern me," Samuel replied, his eyes narrowing as he stood tall. "You can't enforce fake rules to intimidate people." Evan was quick to escalate. "I'm calling the police." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to. They're already here watching you." He gestured toward the patrol car parked across the street. It had been there for some time, almost as if they had been waiting for something to happen. The two teenagers exchanged looks, confusion, and anxiety written all over their faces. They had just wanted to buy a snack, not get caught up in something bigger than them. Samuel could see that they were frightened. "Go ahead and pay for your items," Samuel said to them gently. "I'll wait outside." The teenagers, relieved by the apparent safety of Samuel's intervention, paid for their snacks and made their way to the door. Samuel followed them outside, making sure the situation didn't escalate any further. Inside the patrol car, officers Harris and Dawson observed the situation. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had just finished his first few months on the force and wasn't sure what to make of the old man's calm demeanor. There was something about Samuel Clarke that unsettled him. "That's him," Harris said quietly. "That's the troublemaker." Dawson nodded but didn't look convinced. "He doesn't seem like a troublemaker. He just looks like an old man sticking his nose in a situation he doesn't understand." Harris leaned forward. "Sergeant Dawson said he's been poking around too much in the wrong places. He's a liability." Dawson didn't respond right away. He studied the scene through the patrol car window. There was nothing about Samuel Clarke that screamed dangerous. Nothing except the fact that he had been a thorn in the side of the local government for years. Dawson, however, had been in the game long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. "Let's just see where this goes," Dawson muttered. Across the street, Samuel was helping the teenagers gather their change. They looked visibly relieved, but Samuel's mind was already working overtime. The way the clerk had acted, hovering over the boys, acting suspicious, didn't sit right with him. Samuel had seen this before, the system using seemingly minor infractions to harass certain people. He'd seen it too many times in his investigations. He was so deep in thought that he didn't immediately notice when the officers approached. Harris and Dawson walked up, flashing their badges. "Is there a problem here, sir?" Harris asked, his tone professional, but with a hint of something more, something underlying. Samuel turned, his gaze steady. "No problem. These young men were just buying some snacks. I was doing the same." The clerk called you, not me. Harris gave him a skeptical look. The clerk said you threatened him. Samuel sighed, taking off his glasses and wiping them slowly. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply told the clerk that his selective enforcement of non-existent store policies was discriminatory. Dawson crossed his arms. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Just show us your ID and we can wrap this up. Samuel's expression didn't change. Am I being detained? He asked evenly, his voice calm but firm. Because if not, I'm free to go. Harris hesitated, glancing at Dawson. Dawson seemed to weigh the situation before speaking. We've got a report of a disturbance, and standard procedure is to verify the identity of everyone involved. Samuel shook his head. That's not how it works. I haven't broken any laws, and I'm not obligated to show you ID unless I'm being detained for suspicion of a crime. At that, Harris's patience began to fray. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun holster at his side. Just show us your ID, old man. It'll be easier for everyone. Samuel's expression hardened. I'm not showing you anything until you tell me why you're detaining me. If you're not detaining me, I'll leave. Harris took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You're being difficult. Just show us your ID. Now. Samuel took a step back, maintaining his composure. I'm not a part of this system you've created, officer, and I'm not going to participate in your harassment. That was when things took a dangerous turn. Without warning, Harris shoved Samuel backward, sending the elderly man stumbling. He caught himself on the edge of a display, his glasses slipping off his face. That was unnecessary, Samuel said, straightening himself and adjusting his glasses. I'd like to see your badge number. Harris didn't hesitate. He grabbed Samuel's arm, spinning him roughly around and slamming him against the counter. You're under arrest for resisting and obstructing. Samuel winced at the sharp pain in his arm but held his ground. I've done neither. Dawson, who had been reluctant to get involved, finally stepped forward. Maybe we should cuff him, sir. Harris didn't wait for approval. He motioned to Dawson. Cuff him. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Phones were raised, capturing the unfolding situation. Samuel's dignity remained intact despite the rough handling, his face calm as he was forced into the back of the patrol car. This is a mistake, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying an unspoken promise. One you'll regret. The news hit Michael Clarke like a punch to the gut. His father, Samuel Clarke, had been arrested. He read the message from his secretary over and over, each time the words feeling more surreal. Samuel Clarke, arrested at Wilson's Corner Store, held without charges, detained by the 24th Precinct. It didn't make sense. Samuel was many things, meticulous, driven, relentless in his pursuit of justice. But he wasn't a criminal. Michael's first thought was to call the precinct, but he knew it wouldn't be that easy. Not in this city, not with this kind of power at play. Michael had been a federal judge for over a decade, known for his unflinching stance against corruption and the vast web of criminal operations in the city. He had dismantled several cases involving money laundering, fraud, and racketeering, but never had he expected to be personally affected by one of his own cases. As he put down the phone, Michael's mind raced. What had his father uncovered this time? Michael's father had always been cautious about sharing details of his work, preferring to keep things close to the chest. But Michael knew enough to understand that Samuel's retirement hadn't meant his work had stopped. If anything, it had intensified. Samuel had kept detailed records, files that Michael had never fully understood, but knew held explosive potential. Now they were more valuable than ever. The arrest, though, didn't sit right with Michael. He knew his father. Samuel didn't start fights, but he finished them, especially when it came to injustice. And the way things had unfolded, the strange store clerk, the call to the police, it all reeked of a setup. Michael picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. Eleanor, he said, his voice tight, I need you to dig into something for me. Get everything you can on the officers involved in my father's arrest. Derek Harris and Frank Dawson, personnel files, disciplinary records, anything that can give us insight into why they're targeting Samuel. Eleanor Hayes was Michael's most trusted ally, an attorney who had worked with him on numerous corruption cases. Her expertise in digging through legal loopholes and uncovering hidden truths had made her a formidable force. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She just got things done. Consider it done, she replied, her voice calm but resolute. Michael hung up and stared out the window of his office, overlooking the city he had sworn to protect. He had spent years fighting corrupt systems, but now the fight had come to his door. The Holloways were up against a network that extended far beyond anything he had ever imagined. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He reached for his desk, pulling out a thick folder of documents, his father's files. He began sifting through them, each page a reminder of how deeply Samuel had dug into the city's darkest secrets. Names, dates, transactions, connections to local politicians, and strange links to something bigger. Something connected to the defense industry. Michael's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages, each detail more damning than the last. There it was, the Blackwell Trust, a name that had come up before, in passing, in some of the more obscure documents Michael had read in the past. But it had never seemed important until now. The trust was a shell operation, funneling money through a complex network of companies and government contracts, all designed to hide the true beneficiaries. Michael knew this was it. This was the smoking gun his father had been chasing, the one that connected all the dots. But what had his father discovered? And why was he now in the hands of the people who had the power to silence him? Michael's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Eleanor stepped in, her face set in determination. "I've got something," she said, her voice low. She handed him a file. "It's about Harris and Dawson." Michael flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the information. Derek Harris, a rookie officer, had only been on the force for a few months. His record was clean, but there was something unsettling about him. Michael's fingers hovered over the page, catching on a note about a recent, unusual assignment. He could feel the puzzle pieces starting to fall into place. Harris had been specifically assigned to monitor Samuel after his recent investigation into the Blackwell Trust. Frank Dawson, on the other hand, had a longer career. His record was filled with commendations, but Michael found something odd. Several complaints that had been quietly buried about his involvement in questionable arrests. Dawson had ties to political figures, people who had a vested interest in keeping certain secrets buried. They knew, Michael muttered, the realization dawning on him. They knew exactly what Samuel was investigating. Eleanor nodded. "I think they've been tracking him for months. If Samuel got too close, they were going to take him out of the equation." Michael's mind raced. They've been watching him, monitoring every move, and now that they've got him in custody, they're trying to bury whatever he found. Eleanor looked at him, her expression grim. "We can't let them do that. We need to move fast." Michael stood up, his mind made up. "We need to get to the 24th precinct. I'm going to talk to the officers involved. Get them to spill. If anyone's hiding something, it's them." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "I'll work from here. I've already reached out to some of my sources in the press. If we can get some heat on this, it'll force their hand." Michael nodded. He knew that any misstep could escalate things further, but his father's life was on the line. If Samuel had uncovered the conspiracy he thought he had, it would mean a reckoning for the entire system, a system that was far bigger than they had ever realized. Before Michael left, he grabbed the file on the Blackwell Trust. He couldn't take any chances. The information was too valuable, and it would be the key to unraveling the conspiracy once and for all. As he walked out the door, he felt the weight of everything that was about to unfold. This was no longer just about one man's investigation. This was about bringing down a network of corruption that stretched across the city, and Michael was ready to tear it apart piece by piece. Samuel Clarke had been through a lot in his life. As a forensic accountant, he had survived close calls, pressure from powerful figures, and threats that could make most men bend. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold, clinical silence that surrounded him now. He had been taken from the 24th precinct in the dead of night, bundled into an unmarked van, his hands still cuffed behind his back. There had been no explanation for his transfer, no indication of what was happening, only the oppressive weight of secrecy. His mind was sharp, but he couldn't piece together the full picture just yet. He knew they were trying to bury him, but how deep did this go? The van had stopped in front of a facility so unremarkable it might have been mistaken for an abandoned warehouse. But Samuel knew better. The Blackwell Center was not a place for ordinary criminals. It was a place for people like him, people who knew too much. The door to the van opened, and two men in tactical gear pulled him out. They didn't speak, just led him down a dimly lit hallway, the sounds of their boots echoing off the sterile walls. Samuel's glasses had been taken from him, his vision blurred, but his senses were still sharp. He could feel the heaviness in the air, the kind of place that operated beyond the law, beyond the Constitution. He had been in situations like this before, isolated, interrogated, but this felt different. These men weren't asking questions to uncover the truth. They were here to erase it. The door to a small, stark interrogation room opened, and Samuel was shoved inside. The room was empty except for a metal chair and a table. The harsh, fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, making the room feel colder. A man in a dark suit entered. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. He didn't introduce himself, just sat down across from Samuel, flipping open a thin folder in front of him. "Mr. Clarke," the man said coolly, "you've caused quite a stir." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He sat back, trying to collect his thoughts, trying to read the man across from him. The look in his eyes gave nothing away. "Do you know why you're here?" the man asked after a long pause. Samuel's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was laced with bitterness. "I assume it's not for a friendly chat over coffee." The man didn't smile back. "We need your records, the ones you've been keeping all these years. Your notes, your files, all of it. What you've uncovered about Blackwell Trust." Samuel's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained impassive. The Blackwell Trust, the very thing he had spent years investigating, the thing that had tied the police force, politicians and corporations together in one giant web of corruption, the thing that could bring the entire system down. He had expected this. He had always known that the truth he held could destroy the powerful people at the top, but they had underestimated him. Samuel was never one to hand over his work. Not easily, not ever. "I don't have any records," Samuel said flatly, his voice even. "And even if I did, you're not getting them." The man across from him leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You don't have a choice, Mr. Clarke. You think you're in control here, but you're not. You can either cooperate or this will get more complicated." Samuel stared him down, unflinching. "Complicated? I've dealt with complicated my whole life. You think this little stunt will intimidate me?" The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "You don't understand. You don't get to decide how this goes. You've been a problem for too long, and you're not the one calling the shots now. The people who run this city don't like problems, and you, Samuel Clarke, are a very big problem." Samuel felt a slight chill run down his spine, but he refused to let it show. He had heard threats before, empty threats. These people didn't scare him. He had lived through too much to fear the likes of them. But that didn't mean he didn't recognize the danger. The calm, calculated way this man spoke, the way he dismissed Samuel as if he were nothing more than a piece of evidence to be collected. It was clear that these people weren't playing by any rules Samuel knew. "You've been investigating something bigger than you ever imagined," the man continued. "We know about the Blackwell Trust. We know what you've been digging into, and we know you've been keeping records of it. Those records are the key to everything, and we need them." Samuel remained silent. The truth was, he had kept records, personal notes that had never made it into the official reports. But they were hidden, buried in a place only he knew, a place only someone who knew him intimately would think to look. He had always been careful, always one step ahead, and for now he needed to keep it that way. The man across from him seemed to sense Samuel's resistance. He let out a slow breath, as if trying to regain control. "You'll come around," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Eventually." But Samuel wasn't listening anymore. His mind was working quickly, piecing together what was happening. He knew why they had brought him here, why they were trying to break him. They needed those records, and they would stop at nothing to get them. As the minutes dragged on, the man stood up, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "You're making a mistake. Your son will never find you in time. There are bigger forces at work here, Samuel. Forces you can't even begin to understand." Samuel's lips twitched into a grim smile. "You don't know, my son." The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment before leaving. "Think about what you're doing," he said, and then the door slammed shut behind him, leaving Samuel alone in the sterile room, the silence pressing in on him. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He had to stay calm. He had to hold out just a little longer. The only thing that mattered now was protecting the records. The records were the key to bringing this entire corrupt system down. And Samuel Clarke wasn't about to let anyone take them from him. The city felt different now. For Michael Clarke, the weight of everything had shifted. His father's arrest wasn't just an isolated event. It was a warning, a shot across the bow of everything Michael had worked for. The network of corruption his father had been investigating had moved from the shadows into the daylight, and now the battle was personal. Michael sat at his desk, surrounded by scattered papers, his mind racing as he reviewed the new information that Eleanor had gathered. The more he pieced together, the clearer it became. Samuel had uncovered something enormous, and now those responsible for hiding it were desperate to stop him from revealing the truth. Eleanor had managed to track down the personnel files for Officers Harris and Dawson, the two officers who had arrested Samuel. What she found was disturbing, especially concerning Harris. The rookie officer had no prior history of misconduct, but there was an unusual assignment on his record. He had been specifically ordered to follow Samuel Clarke after his recent investigation into the Blackwell Trust. The fact that Harris was so new to the force yet had been tasked with monitoring someone as well-known as Samuel raised alarms. Michael could feel the pieces starting to fall into place. Someone at the top had been paying attention to Samuel's work. They knew what he was onto, and now they were trying to shut him down. But Dawson's file was even more telling. Dawson had been on the force for nearly 20 years and had built a reputation for being a loyal, rule-abiding officer. Yet buried deep within his record, Michael found several complaints, allegations of excessive force, and questionable arrests that had mysteriously been dropped or ignored. One detail in particular caught his attention. Dawson had been in contact with city officials on several occasions, people tied directly to the very political network Samuel had been investigating. Michael rubbed his temples, trying to connect the dots. It was clear that both Harris and Dawson were part of a much larger system, one that was using its power to protect people like Senator Blackwood, a name that had started to appear more and more in Samuel's files. Blackwood wasn't just a politician. He was one of the key figures behind the Blackwell Trust, the financial network that had funneled millions of dollars through fake companies and illicit government contracts. As Michael turned the pages of his father's investigation, a sense of urgency began to build inside him. Samuel hadn't just uncovered fraud. He had uncovered a vast conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of both the police department and state government. But what exactly was it? What was Blackwood involved in, and what did the trust really fund? That's when Michael saw it. In the corner of one page, amidst financial records and cryptic notes, was a series of transactions involving military-grade surveillance equipment, gear bought with public funds, but never delivered to the police department. Instead, the money had been funneled through the Blackwell Trust to an unnamed entity. It was a pattern that repeated itself, and Michael recognized what it was: a massive, hidden surveillance network that used police equipment to spy on the very people who were supposed to be protected by the law. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. The Blackwell Trust wasn't merely a way to steal funds. It was a cover for an expansive program that used government resources to track judges, political opponents, journalists, and anyone else who could threaten the established power structure. And Samuel had been getting too close to it all. Michael slammed the folder shut. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. The truth was out there, and his father had been the one to find it. Now he had to do everything in his power to stop it from being buried. He quickly dialed Eleanor's number, his fingers shaking slightly as he held the phone to his ear. "Eleanor," he said when she picked up, "we need to act fast. My father found something far bigger than I thought. The Blackwell Trust is a front for a government surveillance program. They've been using police equipment to track and control anyone they deem a threat." Eleanor's voice crackled over the line. "I knew it. It's all coming together. But we don't have much time. If they haven't already erased all the records, they will soon. I'm pulling some strings to get us more information, but we need leverage. They're going to try and silence your father." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "We can't let them. We need to expose everything. The records are the key. Without them, we have nothing. Eleanor paused for a moment. I've been digging into Blackwood, and I think I found something. We've been going after the wrong angle. Blackwood's people aren't just political figures. They're tied to private contractors, military-grade security firms. They're the ones who've been orchestrating the surveillance program. Michael's heart sank. Private contractors? That explains a lot. They've been using the guise of law enforcement to cover their tracks. Exactly. And it gets worse. Blackwood has ties to foreign interests. This isn't just local corruption. It's global. The surveillance program is being used to collect intelligence on political and corporate targets, using the police force as their cover. Michael's mind raced. So it's not just about stealing money. They've been building an intelligence network on American soil, using taxpayer dollars and police resources. And my father uncovered it. That's right, Eleanor said. Your father's investigation went further than anyone else's. They've been watching him closely for months. But now, with all this evidence in hand, we can make the system collapse. We just need to get those records out to the right people before they disappear. Michael's pulse quickened. I'm going to get my father out of there. He's our only link to all this. I won't let them erase him or the truth he holds. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her voice softening. Be careful, Michael. You're not just fighting corrupt officials anymore. You're up against a shadow government that operates beyond the law. If you go after them, they'll come for you too. Michael felt the weight of her words, but he didn't flinch. His father had spent his life exposing the truth, and now it was his turn to do the same. If the system was going to be taken down, it would have to come from within, and Michael Clarke would be the one to do it. I know, he said, but we're in this now, and I'm not backing down. He hung up, his resolve hardening. The fight was bigger than he had realized, but if he was going to save his father and the city, he had to play the long game. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. As Michael left his office, he glanced at the city skyline. He had always believed in justice, but now that belief would be tested more than ever. The war for the truth had begun, and nothing, not even the most powerful forces in the city, could stop it. Michael paced the length of his office, the heavy weight of the evidence he had just uncovered pressing down on him. He felt the walls closing in. The Blackwell Trust wasn't just some criminal scheme. It was a massive operation designed to control the city and beyond, with roots planted deeply in the highest offices. And now, with his father being held at the Blackwell Center, the entire operation was at risk of being exposed. He reached for his phone and dialed Eleanor's number again, his mind spinning with plans and contingencies. There was so much to do, so many people to bring in, so many risks to take. But the one thing that gave him a sense of urgency was the nagging feeling that, at any moment, someone in the system could strike a fatal blow to their progress. They needed to move fast. Eleanor, I'm heading to the press conference, Michael said as soon as she picked up. We've got to push the information out there now. The public needs to know what's going on. We need their support. Eleanor's voice was calm, but Michael could hear the tension beneath it. Michael, you know this could blow back on us. We don't have all the pieces yet. And if Blackwood's people are already aware of your investigation, they'll be watching you closely. The last thing we need is for them to make you their next target. Michael glanced out of the window at the city below. He knew the stakes, and he knew Eleanor was right. But he also knew they had no choice. If they didn't take action now, they would lose everything. His father's safety, the truth, and the opportunity to take down the people who had been operating above the law for far too long. I understand, but we can't wait any longer. The longer we keep this hidden, the more dangerous it gets. And I'm not going to let them bury my father, or the truth. Eleanor sighed. All right, Michael, I'll get in touch with the whistleblower. We've been getting some information from the inside, and it's crucial we bring it to light. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The whistleblower? What do you have? There's someone inside the police department, someone close to the center of it all, who's willing to speak out. I've been getting encrypted messages for weeks now. They've seen the files, they know what's going on. This could be the key to pushing everything into the open. Michael's pulse quickened. This could be it. Get them to come forward. We need to get everything they know to the public. They can't hide the truth once the world knows. Before Eleanor could respond, there was a knock at the door. Michael opened it to find a messenger holding a thick envelope. He took it, his eyes scanning the return address. It was from his father's lawyer. Eleanor had been expecting this. It was the final piece of the puzzle they needed to officially move forward. He tore open the envelope. Inside was a sealed report, Samuel's personal ledger, filled with detailed notes about the Blackwell Trust, about the surveillance program, and about the deep ties between the police force and the state government. The document confirmed what Michael already suspected. This operation was far-reaching. Samuel had written it all down, and now it was time to use it. "Eleanor," Michael said, his voice steely, "we've got what we need. I'm going to release this to the press." Eleanor's voice came back steady. "I'll set up the release, but be careful. You're going to make a lot of enemies doing this. The people involved in this aren't just petty criminals. They're the ones who pull the strings, and they'll come after you." Michael nodded. "I know what's at stake, but it's bigger than us now. This isn't just about saving my father anymore. It's about exposing the system and making sure this never happens again." As Michael ended the call, a deep sense of determination settled over him. He had been fighting his whole life for justice, but this was the moment everything had been leading up to. There was no turning back now. The corruption he had spent his career fighting was bigger than he had ever imagined, and it was all tied to people who had no regard for the law or for the lives of ordinary citizens. Hours later, Michael stood in front of a crowd of reporters at a hastily called press conference. The stakes had never been higher, and he knew that once he spoke, the world would never look at the city or its leaders the same way again. He stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room. The questions began almost immediately, and Michael answered them one by one, his voice unwavering. He didn't hide from the tough questions. Instead, he used them as an opportunity to expose the truth. "The evidence speaks for itself," Michael said, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. "We've uncovered a massive surveillance operation funded by taxpayer dollars. This system has been used to track and control political opponents, journalists, and anyone who might threaten the interests of the powerful. The Blackwell Trust is at the heart of this corruption, a front for illegal financial transactions, surveillance programs, and the abuse of power." The room fell silent for a moment. The weight of Michael's words hung in the air. The men behind this operation, Senator Blackwood, Chief Huxley, and others, have been using the police department as their personal tool for control. But this is where it ends. The truth is out, and we will fight to make sure that those responsible face justice. As Michael finished speaking, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, the cameras clicking incessantly. But Michael knew the most important part was done. The truth was out, and now the world would have to reckon with it. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor was meeting with the whistleblower, a detective named Sarah Moore, who had reached out to her weeks ago. Sarah had been on the inside, seeing firsthand the corruption she had been forced to overlook. She was terrified, but she was also determined to do the right thing. "I can't keep quiet anymore," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I've seen the files. I know what they're doing. They've been tracking everyone, and they've been using our own equipment to spy on us. I didn't know who to trust, but when I saw what they were doing to your father, I knew I had to come forward." Eleanor nodded, her face hardening. "You've made the right choice. We need your testimony. Everything you know. This isn't just about one man. This is about bringing down an entire network." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'll give you everything I have, but you need to understand, this isn't just a local operation. There are people with more power than we can imagine involved in this. They won't stop until they've silenced us all." Eleanor smiled grimly. "They might have the power, but they don't have the truth, and that's what's going to bring them down." As Eleanor left the meeting, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The pieces were finally falling into place. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Sarah's testimony, they had the final piece they needed. Now it was just a matter of getting the truth out before it was buried once again. The night had fallen, and the city felt like it was holding its breath. Michael stood in the shadows outside the Blackwell Center, his eyes scanning the high walls and the security cameras that dotted the perimeter. The facility was built to house high-risk detainees, but it wasn't a prison. It was worse. It was a place for people who had seen too much, people like his father, Samuel Clarke. And now Michael was about to break in to get him out. The intel had come in fast. Eleanor had worked tirelessly, reaching out to her network of legal contacts, digging into the underground world of government contractors, and finding the weaknesses in the Blackwell Center's security. She had managed to confirm that the building was on lockdown after the recent chaos, and they would have a narrow window to make their move. "We need to move quickly," Michael said, his voice low as he spoke into the earpiece. "No room for error." Beside him, a team of operatives, ex-military contractors who had once worked for the government but had become disillusioned with the system, readied their gear. The operation had been carefully planned, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The people who ran the Blackwell Center were not amateurs. They had been tracking Samuel for months, and now they would likely be ready for any attempt to extract him. But Michael wasn't about to let that stop him. His father had risked everything to uncover the truth, and now it was his turn to do the same. The plan was simple: get in, get Samuel, and get out before anyone even realized what had happened. But nothing about this felt simple. Michael knew that once they set foot inside, the countdown to disaster would begin. "All right," Michael said, glancing at the others. "Let's move." The team moved like shadows, slipping through the darkness toward the maintenance tunnel they had identified earlier. It was a high-risk entry point, but it was the only one that wouldn't be under constant surveillance. They disabled the security sensors ahead of time, and now they were entering the compound undetected. As they made their way through the damp, narrow tunnel, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of what was at stake. Samuel wasn't just his father. He was the key to everything. If they could get him out, they would have the evidence they needed to bring down the entire corrupt network. But if they failed, it would mean the end of any chance for justice. When they reached the central building, they encountered their first obstacle: armed guards. The Blackwell Center wasn't designed to be an easy target. It was a fortress, and anyone who got too close would be met with resistance. The team moved swiftly, silencing the guards before they could sound an alarm. Every movement was calculated, every step taken with precision. Inside the building, the tension grew thicker. Michael could feel his pulse quickening as they neared the holding cells. He had been here before, in places like this. Places where the truth was locked away, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. But tonight, he wasn't going to let that happen. Not to his father, and not to the people who depended on them to expose the truth. "Keep your heads down," one of the operatives whispered. "We're almost there." The corridor was eerily silent, and the dim lighting made it hard to see. But Michael had been trained for situations like this. His eyes were sharp, his mind focused on the mission ahead. He couldn't afford to lose his father now, not after everything they had fought for. Finally, they reached the holding cell. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he saw his father, Samuel, sitting on a metal cot, his hands still shackled to the wall. His father's face was bruised, his hair disheveled, but there was no mistaking the steely resolve in his eyes. "Dad," Michael whispered, rushing toward him. Samuel's head snapped up, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Michael," he said, his voice hoarse but strong, "what are you doing here?" "We're getting you out," Michael said, pulling out the key card Eleanor had managed to procure. With a swift motion, he unlocked the shackles, and his father rubbed his wrists, wincing at the soreness. "No time to explain," Michael added, grabbing Samuel by the arm. "We have to move." They rushed back through the corridors, the team moving as quickly as possible without making a sound. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step felt like it was bringing them closer to the moment when everything would go wrong. Just as they reached the maintenance tunnel, the first alarms went off. The sound was deafening, echoing through the halls as red lights flashed overhead. The Blackwell Center had been breached. "They know we're here," one of the operatives said, pulling out his weapon. "Move!" Michael shouted, pushing his father ahead of him as they sprinted down the hallway. The team fired in quick bursts, silencing any guards who came too close. But the sound of footsteps was getting louder. They were running out of time. They reached the tunnel, and just as they were about to exit, a group of armed men emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. "Stay down!" one of the operatives yelled, opening fire. The fight was quick and brutal. The team took out the guards with swift efficiency, but they knew that reinforcements were on the way. The sound of sirens filled the air, and Michael's heart raced. They were almost there. They had to make it to the extraction point. When they finally emerged from the tunnel and into the open air, they were met by a black SUV waiting for them. The vehicle's doors opened, and Michael shoved his father inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "Go!" Michael shouted at the driver. The SUV sped off into the night, the sound of gunfire fading in the distance. As they drove through the city streets, Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had done it. They had gotten Samuel out. But as Michael looked at his father, his relief quickly turned to worry. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. The people behind this operation wouldn't stop until they had silenced Samuel, and now they knew who was behind the attempt to bring it down. "We're not done yet," Michael said, his voice grim. "They'll come after us harder now. We've only just begun." Samuel nodded, his face serious. "I know, but we have the evidence now, and that's what's going to bring them down." Michael's mind raced. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The Blackwell Trust was just the tip of the iceberg. There were bigger forces at play, but with Samuel by his side, Michael felt a renewed sense of hope. They would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The night air was cold and heavy as the black SUV sped through the city, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Michael glanced at his father, Samuel, who sat quietly beside him, his expression grim but resolute. Samuel had been through worse, far worse, but Michael could tell this time was different. This time, the stakes weren't just about one man's freedom. This was about exposing a system so entrenched that it had been able to manipulate the lives of thousands, maybe even millions, for years. "We're safe for now," Michael said, his voice low. "But it's only a matter of time before they come after us. We can't let them silence us." Samuel's eyes, still sharp despite the exhaustion, met his son's. "You're right. They won't stop just because we escaped the Blackwell Center. They'll come at us harder, and we have to be ready. But you've got something they don't: evidence. The truth is on our side." Michael clenched his fists, his mind racing with possibilities. They had the files. Samuel's meticulous records, hidden in plain sight, were their only leverage. Those records detailing the Blackwell Trust's corruption, the stolen millions, and the network of government officials involved in a vast surveillance operation were the key to taking down not just the corrupt police force, but the politicians and corporate interests behind it. "First thing tomorrow, we get this out to the press," Michael said, his voice firm with determination. "We need to go public before they can cover their tracks. We'll leak everything. The records, the surveillance program, everything. They can't hide the truth once it's out there." Samuel nodded. "It's dangerous, Michael, but you're right. We've already made a lot of noise, and now we need to make sure the world hears it. If we don't, they'll just bury us." The SUV took a sharp turn, and they arrived at a safe house, tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Michael had arranged for it earlier, knowing that they couldn't stay anywhere too close to the city center. Samuel had barely set foot inside the house before the team went to work. They locked all the doors, checked every window, and turned on the security system. The safe house wasn't much, just a small, nondescript building, but it was secure for now. Eleanor was already there, waiting for them. She stood in the corner of the room, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones. When she saw them, she quickly ended the call. "They're already trying to suppress the story," she said, her eyes grim. "News outlets are starting to pick up on the leaks, but there's been a coordinated push to discredit everything. The governor's office is calling the entire thing a fabrication, a smear campaign. They're claiming that the documents we've shared are forged." Michael's blood ran cold at the mention of the governor. He had suspected this would happen. They had expected the initial pushback, but it was clear now that the people they were up against weren't just criminals. They were powerful players who had the means to manipulate the narrative, control the media, and use their influence to crush anyone who got in their way. "They're going to fight us every step of the way," Michael said, a sharp edge to his voice. "But we can't let them rewrite the story. We've got to hit them harder." Eleanor nodded. "I'm already coordinating with the press. We need to find the right outlets, the ones who aren't afraid to speak the truth. We can't trust anyone who's compromised. The whistleblower's testimony should help, but it's crucial that we get the records into the right hands." Michael looked at his father, who was sitting quietly on a chair, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. Samuel's presence was a constant source of strength. He was the reason they were here, the one who had pieced together the truth over the years and held it in his hands. Now it was time to use that truth to bring the system down. "We need to be smarter than they expect," Michael said, his mind working through the next steps. "We can't rely on just one method. We need a multi-pronged approach. Leak the documents, get the press to cover the story, and hit them where it hurts, their pockets." Samuel spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "You're right. The money is where it all started. Follow the money and you'll find the people who really control this system. We've got the records, but we need to expose the full scope of the corruption. These people don't just steal from the government, they steal from the people. They steal from the officers they control, from the families who trust them. That's where you hit them hardest." Michael took a deep breath. "I'll get to work on the financial connections. We've got to show the world that this isn't just about political corruption. It's about a system that's been systematically stealing from the very people it was supposed to protect. We need to take away their power." As the night wore on, the team worked tirelessly to compile the documents and prepare them for release. Michael's mind was sharp, but the weight of the task ahead weighed heavily on him. Every decision they made could have consequences, some far-reaching and dangerous. But he was willing to risk it all. His father had been willing to do the same for years, and now it was his turn. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked on getting the press involved. She had contacts in the media who were still loyal to the truth, and she made sure that they had everything they needed to run with the story. The key would be getting the story to spread like wildfire, ensuring that the public knew what had been happening behind closed doors. The team stayed vigilant, watching for any sign of retaliation. They knew the forces they were up against would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Samuel had always been one step ahead, but now it was up to Michael to lead the charge. With the evidence in their hands and the truth on their side, they were ready to bring the fight to those who had stolen everything. As the sun began to rise, Michael stood at the window of the safe house looking out over the city. It was still quiet, but he knew that would change soon. The people who had run this city for years, who had orchestrated the theft, the surveillance, the manipulation, were about to be exposed, and Michael Clarke was going to make sure of it. He turned to his father, who was watching him from across the room. Samuel's eyes softened for a moment, and then he nodded. "We're ready," Samuel said. Michael nodded back. "We are." The city was waking up to the chaos. By morning, the story had broken. The documents had leaked, and the truth was spreading like wildfire. The Blackwell Trust, the surveillance program, the police corruption, and the stolen millions. Everything that Samuel Clarke had uncovered over years of meticulous investigation was now in the hands of the public. Michael stood at the window of the safe house, watching the streets below. The city that had always felt like home was now a battlefield. The news vans had arrived in force. Journalists swarmed the precincts, the governor's mansion, and the state police headquarters. The scandal was too big to ignore now. The weight of the story was beginning to hit, and Michael knew that everything was about to change. But change didn't come without a cost. "How long do we have?" Michael asked, turning to Eleanor, who was pacing the room, eyes fixed on her phone. They had been moving quickly, but they still weren't out of danger. "They're moving fast," Eleanor replied, glancing up at Michael. "Already there's been a pushback. The governor's office is claiming that the documents are fabricated, that they've been doctored. But I've managed to get the whistleblower's testimony out to the right outlets. We have enough support now. It's too late for them to stop the story from breaking." Samuel, who had been silently reviewing the documents in front of him, looked up. "They'll try to bury this, Michael. They'll do everything they can. You need to take this to the next level. Get it to the people who can't be silenced. I've seen this before." Michael's jaw tightened. He knew his father was right. The opposition would come in waves. First the media manipulation, then the legal battles. They would try to discredit them, disprove the evidence, and intimidate those who were speaking out. But they couldn't stop now, not after everything they had been through. "We've got to hit them harder," Michael said, determination settling in his voice. "If we don't keep the pressure on, they'll push us back into the shadows. We need the world watching." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "I've set up a press conference for later today. We'll have witnesses, legal experts, and whistleblowers ready to testify. The world will know the full scope of what's been happening. The evidence is undeniable. We've already secured enough media support to make sure they can't silence us." Just as she finished speaking, Michael's phone rang. He glanced at the number and saw that it was from an unknown source. He answered quickly. "Michael Clarke," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "Judge Clarke, this is Detective Sarah Moore," came the voice on the other end. "You need to act fast. I've just been told that they're moving on your father. They're transferring him again. I don't know where, but I have a bad feeling about this." Michael's heart sank. "Sarah, we're running out of time. Where are they taking him?" "I don't have all the details yet," Sarah said urgently, "but I overheard a conversation. It's not going to be good for him. They're trying to make him disappear. And if they do, the case will go cold." The line went dead before Michael could ask anything further. His pulse quickened. They were running out of time. "Eleanor," Michael said, urgency creeping into his voice. "They're moving him again. We need to act now." Eleanor's eyes widened. She already understood. "I'll get the press conference ready, but we'll need to move on the Blackwell Center again. If they're taking your father out of the city, it's our last chance to stop them." Michael didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The Blackwell Center was as impenetrable as it had been before, but now with everything on the line, Michael had to rely on what he knew best: strategy. His father had taught him how to plan, how to navigate the maze of politics and power, and now it was time to apply those lessons in the field. He gathered his team of operatives once again, Eleanor, Sarah, and a handful of trusted individuals, and set the plan into motion. They would infiltrate the Blackwell Center from the back, using the same maintenance tunnel they had used for the initial rescue. This time, though, the opposition would be ready. They would be expecting a strike. The team moved quickly through the city streets, the weight of the operation pressing down on them. Michael's mind raced, but there was no room for doubt. They had to get to his father before the transfer happened. If they could expose the conspiracy before they silenced Samuel, they would have the leverage they needed to bring down the entire system. They arrived at the Blackwell Center, and once again, the team slipped inside undetected. The corridors were quiet, too quiet, and the air was thick with tension. The guards were more alert now, and the urgency of the situation was evident in the quick glances and hushed conversations. Michael and the team moved like shadows, avoiding the security cameras and slipping past the few remaining guards. Finally, they reached the holding cell, but as they turned the corner, a sound echoed down the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Michael's heart raced as he saw a group of men in tactical gear approaching, blocking their way. The Blackwell Center had been waiting for them. "Stay back," one of the operatives shouted as they raised their weapons. "Let's make this count," Michael said, his voice low and commanding. "We can't let them take him." The team immediately engaged in a firefight, the noise echoing through the halls. The guards tried to return fire, but the operatives moved with precision, using cover and firing in short bursts. Michael pushed forward, ignoring the chaos around him. The only thing that mattered was getting his father out. They reached the cell, and to Michael's shock, Samuel was already standing by the door, waiting for them. "Dad," Michael said, his voice filled with both relief and disbelief. Samuel gave a small, tired smile. "I knew you'd come." But before Michael could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A loud explosion rang out from somewhere deeper within the facility. "Move!" Michael shouted. They rushed down the hallway, but as they turned the corner, they were met by even more guards. The facility had been locked down, and escape was becoming impossible. "Get him to the extraction point," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'll cover you." Michael hesitated for a moment, but he knew that there was no choice. His father had fought for so long. Now it was time for Michael to finish the fight. As the team made their way toward the exit, they fought back the guards, each moment stretching longer than the last. They reached the underground parking garage where the extraction vehicle waited. Just as they were about to get in, Michael heard the sound of sirens. "They know we're here," he said, his eyes scanning the area. "We have to move now." The team piled into the vehicle, and as the engine roared to life, Michael glanced back at the Blackwell Center, the place where his father had been held, the place where their battle had begun. They had won this round, but they were far from finished. As they sped away, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of both relief and dread. The conspiracy had been exposed, but the battle was only beginning. Samuel's health and safety were still at risk, and the powerful forces behind the Blackwell Trust were not finished yet. But for the first time, Michael knew they had the upper hand. They had the truth. The war was far from over, but with Samuel by his side, Michael Clarke would fight until the very end.